It's not something you hear every day.
Yeah.
You know, a U.S. president, especially one who's been in office, expressing interest in buying territories, like we saw with former President Trump.
Yeah.
And his comments about Greenland, Canada, even the Panama Canal.
It's really something.
It's certainly not your typical political move.
It makes you think.
I have to say your research on this is fascinating.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
You've got these statements that almost seem like they're pulled from a history book, but here we are in the 21st century grappling with them and the reactions from the countries involved. Well, let's just say they were a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Before we go any further, though, if you're interested in this kind of deep dive into global politics and history, make sure to hit that subscribe button.
Absolutely.
We'd love to have you join us on this journey.
Now let's start with Greenland.
Okay.
Trump's interest in acquiring it wasn't exactly a secret.
Right.
He mentioned it on multiple occasions going back to 2019.
It wasn't just talk either. He actually made a social media post about it.
Wow.
Claiming that owning Greenland was necessary for U.S. national security and freedom.
Okay.
Now, Greenland's response was pretty clear.
Yeah.
Not for sale.
Wow.
They were very firm about maintaining their autonomy, which they've worked hard to achieve. But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Trump wasn't the first U.S. president to entertain the idea of buying Greenland.
Wait, really?
Yes, the first proposal to purchase Greenland actually dates back to the 1860s.
Huh.
It seems like there's a historical pattern here.
Wow.
And when you look at Greenland's strategic location, sitting right on the shortest route between the U.S. and Europe, and already housing a large U.S. space facility, you can start to understand why it keeps popping up on the radar.
It's incredible. It really makes you think about how geography and geopolitics are so intertwined.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you think about a country attempting to buy another territory in the modern era?
It's a great question.
Is that even a viable concept in today's world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're finding this discussion as fascinating as we are, don't forget to give this a like.
Right.
Now, this one is a little bit different. Remember when Trump suggested that Canada should just become the 51st U.S. state?
Oh, yeah, that was during a dinner.
Oh, yes, that was during a dinner with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, right?
With Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
Right?
It seemed more lighthearted, though.
It did.
Almost like a joke.
Yeah.
In response to Trudeau raising concerns about Trump's proposed tariffs on Canadian goods.
You're right. It did seem like a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment.
Yeah.
But then Trump followed it up by posting an AI-generated image of himself with a Canadian flag, which just added another layer to the whole situation.
Oh, wow.
Canada's reaction was interesting, a blend of humor and concern, with some officials emphasizing the strong trade relationship between the two countries.
It's almost as if they were trying to steer the conversation back to more serious matters, while also acknowledging the absurdity of this suggestion. So we have Greenland with a firm no, based on a desire for autonomy, and Canada responding with a mix of humor and concern, likely due to their close relationship with the U.S.
Precisely. And then we have the Panama Canal, which presents yet another fascinating dynamic.
Okay.
Trump suggested that the U.S. should reassert control over the canal, complaining about what he called ridiculous fees charged to ships passing through.
Right.
But to truly understand the situation, you need to know a little bit about the history.
Right. The U.S. has a long and complicated history with the Panama Canal. They built it and controlled it for decades before relinquishing control to Panama in 1999.
Yeah.
Under a treaty signed in 1977.
Exactly. So Trump's suggestion essentially amounted to proposing a reversal of that historical agreement.
Right.
And as you might imagine, Panama wasn't too keen on the idea.
Yeah.
Their president at the time, President Molino, firmly rejected the suggestion, emphasizing Panama's sovereignty over the canal and its critical role in their economy.
Yeah, makes sense. They weren't about to let go of something so vital to their nation, especially not after having fought for control of it for so long. But what about those ridiculous fees that Trump mentioned?
Right.
Was there any merit to that claim?
Well, like many things in geopolitics, it's complicated.
Okay.
The Panama Canal has been facing operational challenges in recent years. They were dealing with a significant drought, which was impacting the canal's water levels and overall functionality.
Right.
So part of the reason for the fee increase was to offset these costs and maintain the canal's operation.
Okay.
It wasn't quite as simple as Trump made it out to be.
So it sounds like there were legitimate reasons for the fee increases.
Right.
Reasons that went beyond simply trying to gouge the U.S. or other countries.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of understanding the full context before jumping to conclusions. Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric, right, but there's often a lot more going on beneath the surface.
That's a great point. And it's something we'll keep in mind as we continue to unpack these territorial ambitions.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on, I want to hear from you.
Okay.
What are your initial thoughts on all of this?
Yeah.
Do you see any common threads running through these three situations?
Right.
And are you surprised by any of the reactions? Share your insights in the comments. We always appreciate hearing your perspectives.
We do. And make sure to stick around because we're going to dive even deeper into the implications of all of this, exploring what these statements reveal about global power dynamics and America's place in the world.
Oh, great.
It's a conversation you won't want to miss. You know, it's been fascinating reading through the comments and seeing your reactions to these situations. It seems like a lot of you are picking up on the same underlying theme that we're seeing here.
You're right. There's definitely a sense that these events, while seemingly isolated, actually speak to a larger trend in global politics. But let's unpack that a bit. We've talked about the specifics of Trump's comments, but what are the broader implications here? What does this all mean for international relations, especially for the U.S.?
It's a great question, and it takes us into some pretty complex territory. Think about it. Acquiring territories in the 21st century isn't as simple as it might have been centuries ago. You can't just sail across an ocean, plant a flag, and call it a day. We're talking about a world governed by international laws, treaties, and perhaps most importantly, the will of the people who live in these territories.
We're long past the age of exploration and colonization where nations could simply claim land as their own.
Exactly. So in that sense, these statements, particularly the ones about Greenland and the Panama Canal, could be viewed as more symbolic than realistic. They raise questions about America's role on the world stage, its influence, and how it perceives its right to exert that influence.
It's like these statements are a way of testing the waters, seeing how far the U.S. can push boundaries in a world that has fundamentally changed since the days of territorial expansion.
Precisely. It's worth remembering that these comments were made during a time of significant global uncertainty and shifting power dynamics. The U.S. was facing challenges from rising powers like China and struggling to maintain its dominance in certain regions.
So maybe, just maybe, these statements were less about actual territorial acquisition and more about projecting an image of power, a way of reminding the world that the U.S. is still a force to be reckoned with.
It's certainly a possibility, but let's not forget about Canada. While the 51st state comment was made in a lighter context, it still touches on the complex relationship between the U.S. and its northern neighbor. They share the longest undefended border in the world and have deeply intertwined economies. But there's also a history of Canadian concern about American influence and a desire to maintain their own distinct national identity.
It's that classic dynamic of being close allies, but also needing to assert independence, wanting to maintain their unique cultural and political identity. And intentionally or not, Trump tapped into that sensitive spot.
He did, and that brings us to another layer of implications, the impact on international relations, regardless of the intention. These statements inevitably strained relationships and caused diplomatic headaches.
Can you imagine being the leader of Greenland or Panama? You've got a U.S. president essentially saying, hey, we want your land. Talk about an awkward situation.
It definitely puts those countries in a difficult position. They have to balance maintaining good relations with the U.S. while also firmly defending their sovereignty. It's a delicate balancing act.
For sure. And it makes you wonder, was this all part of some grand strategy on Trump's part, or was it more about his personal style and tendency to make impulsive remarks?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's difficult to say definitively whether these were calculated moves or off-the-cuff comments. But either way, they had real-world consequences. They forced these countries to reevaluate their relationship with the U.S. and in some cases strengthen their ties with other global players.
It's almost like a domino effect. One seemingly isolated comment can ripple outward and shift the entire geopolitical landscape.
Exactly. It highlights the immense power that words, especially those spoken by a world leader, can carry. They shape perceptions, influence alliances, and can even spark conflicts. It's a lot of responsibility.
And speaking of responsibility, and let's bring this back to you, our listeners. We've talked about the global implications, but this isn't just an abstract geopolitical discussion happening in some far-off corner of the world. It affects you directly.
Absolutely.
Think about it. Understanding these power dynamics, these territorial ambitions, it helps you make sense of the world around you. It helps you understand why certain countries act the way they do, why certain alliances are formed, and why certain conflicts erupt.
You're right. It's like having a key to decode the news, to understand the complexities behind the headlines. And that knowledge can empower you to make more informed decisions in your own life.
Exactly. Whether it's about where you choose to travel, invest, or even just how you engage in conversations about politics and global events, this kind of understanding gives you a deeper perspective. Now, before we move on to the final part of our discussion, we'd love to hear from you what resonates with you most about this conversation. What new insights have you gained? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're enjoying this discussion, don't forget to give us a like. It helps us know what kind of content you find valuable.
We appreciate your engagement. Now let's bring this conversation back to the present day. The political landscape has shifted since these comments were made, but the underlying questions about power, territory, and international relations remain as relevant as ever.
They do. And that leads us to a final thought-provoking question to consider as we wrap up this part of our discussion. What if these statements, as provocative as they might seem, were actually more symbolic than realistic? What would that symbolism reveal about the American psyche, especially regarding its role in the world?
Now, that's a question that deserves some serious thought.
It is, and it's one that we'll explore further when we return for the final part of our discussion. Stay tuned. We're back and ready to tackle that final thought-provoking question we left you with. If Trump's statements about acquiring territories were more about symbolism than actual intentions, what might that tell us about how America views itself on the global stage?
It's a complex question, and the comments have really brought out some insightful perspectives. What strikes me is how these statements, whether intentionally or not, tap into a narrative that has been woven through American history, the idea of manifest destiny of American exceptionalism.
Okay, for those who might not be familiar, manifest destiny was this 19th century belief that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. But how does the 19th century concept connect to a 21st century president's comments about acquiring territories?
Well, maybe it's not so much about physical expansion anymore, but more of a psychological or ideological one. These statements, in a way, could reflect a desire to reassert American dominance, to reclaim a perceived position of global leadership that some feel has been slipping away.
So it's like a nostalgia for a time when the U.S. was the undisputed superpower, calling the shots on the world stage. And these statements, even if unrealistic, are a way of expressing that yearning.
That's a very interesting way to put it. And it's important to note that this feeling isn't limited to one side of the political spectrum. While Trump's comments might be the most prominent examples, there's a broader sentiment among some Americans, regardless of their political affiliations, that the U.S. should be number one, that it has a unique and indispensable role in shaping world events.
It's like that saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. But maybe in this case, the speaking wasn't so soft, even if the stick wielding was more symbolic.
Exactly. It's about projecting strength, even if the means of achieving or demonstrating that strength are more about words than actions. But here's the thing, the world has changed. The U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. We live in a multipolar world with rising powers like China and a renewed assertiveness from countries like Russia.
It's like trying to play by the old rules in a game that has completely evolved. What worked in the past might not be effective or even appropriate in the present, let alone the future.
That's a great analogy, and it brings up a crucial point. This symbolic projection of power might be more counterproductive than effective in today's world. It risks alienating potential allies and escalating tensions with rivals.
So what's the solution then? If the U.S. can't just dictate its will to the rest of the world anymore, what role should it play in the 21st century?
That's the million-dollar question. The reality is that the U.S. can still play a vital role on the global stage, but that role might need to evolve. It might require more collaboration, more diplomacy, a willingness to listen to and understand the perspectives and interests of other nations. It's about finding a balance between asserting one's own interests and contributing to a more cooperative and interconnected world.
That's a powerful message, and one that I think resonates deeply with what we've been discussing. It's not about retreating from the world stage, but about engaging with it in a different way, a way that recognizes the realities of a multipolar world.
Okay.
And before we wrap up, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on America's role in the 21st century? How do you think it can navigate this complex and ever-changing global landscape? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed this conversation as much as we have, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating topics.
We look forward to hearing your perspectives and continuing this important conversation. Thanks for joining us.